Here we are, and we're in class number 22. I think we'll be on class 23 and end this whole thing because we're already finally at Hebrews chapter 12. And Hebrews chapter 12 is really the last part of the book that is going to be some doctrinal stuff. And then we're going to get into some practical applications and close off the study because we'll be at the end. And if we end next week early or whatever, then maybe you can think about what has meant the most to you in the book of Hebrews, okay? And all of the classes. In 2 weeks, in 2 weeks. That's right. And so we continue then in our study in the book of Hebrews, and it's just been a joy teaching this book. It always is. It's just a great book. Now we're in the section again, preservation of the saints, which started all the way back in chapter 10 and verse 19 and goes through the end of chapter 12, okay? And again, it's the last doctrinal section. Now, we're in chapter 12, and you remember how chapter 11 ended. In fact, when we looked at chapter 11, it's the longest chapter in all the Bible to make one single point. And that point is that God has made some wonderful promises to us, some that have to do with this world and some that have to do with the next world. And he asks that if you will hold on and keep the faith, no matter what you have to go through, that you will always be rewarded. You may not get it in the same coin, and you may not get it now, but God's promises, if you'll keep the faith and hold on, that you'll have it. That's all he's saying in Hebrews 11, that every one of those people that are found in that chapter. Remember, he started out by telling us what faith is. Faith is the assurance of things what? Hope for. So they don't have it yet. But it's the conviction of things what? Not seen. So if these people of old, he said, that's how they were justified. And that is they lived their lives as though they had it, but they didn't have it yet. Okay? And so he says, if you'll do that, then you'll take you'll learn to be strong in the Lord, and you will receive the blessings. And then, of course, he ended up by saying in verse 39, and all these having gained approval, that is those in the Old Testament, through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Now, what he means by that is they didn't receive what? They didn't receive that final Jesus. They didn't see Jesus. They didn't see the forgiveness of their sins totally, as we do. Because he says, because God has provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. And so here we are. For us, it's a little bit better than for them because they were working on faith of things not yet seen. But we are looking at things that are seen. We go back to the cross. We see it. We really know how God worked everything out so that you and I can have all the promises of God. And isn't that great? I'm glad I live on this side of the cross instead of on the other side in the old covenant. And so now what we're going to look at is the response of faith. And that's what chapter 12 is going to be all about, the response of faith. And the first thing we're going to notice is that true faith will enable us to run the race of life. And that's Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. And so let's go ahead and read this. Verse 1, it says, wherefore seeing we also are encompassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Let me say something, because this is a great principle in life, that if you have this, it's really will help you. And that is, the Christian life is not a sprint, okay? It's a marathon. Sometimes you get to that place where you think you got to beat everyone else. You got to run the race. You got to win. And really, that's not what God asks us to do. He just asks us to get in the race, And some people are runners, and that's fine, but others are walkers, and some are joggers, And so if you'll just walk and jog and head in the direction God wants you to head, that's all He ever asked of us, to stay in the race, to keep your faith and don't lose your faith. And don't stop, okay? Just keep going. And that's basically what he's telling us there. Now, he starts off, and by the way, this section of Scripture is very special to me. I don't think that I've ever been either taught in a church or been to a church where I haven't gotten into this section, okay, and shared some of it with you. And it's been special to me. I'll come back to it on occasion in my own life, when I'm struggling or something. And when he says, wherefore, seeing that we are, I think some verses say, encompassed by, with so great a cloud of witnesses. I went into the history of that word, and the word cloud. And it was very interesting because I went back into the Old Testament and I found, like in Isaiah and Ezekiel, that the word cloud, we think of it as clouds, but it is just really a mass of the saved, okay? A mass of the saved. That's the cloud. We have a cloud today, even. A mass of information somewhere is a cloud. But, there's a cloud, as the Bible uses it, it's this group of the saved. And it's interesting because when you look at it that way and you read the literal Greek from 1 Thessalonians, when it talks about when the Lord comes back again, He's going to come, and it reads in the clouds. But when you go to the Greek, it says in a cloud. In a cloud of what? He's going to come in a cloud of the saved, of the witnesses, of the saved. And then we're going to be called up what? In a cloud with the rest of them, and we're going to be with the Lord. And so what he says is, so since we've got this great cloud of witnesses, okay, he says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily besets us. Now when you think about this, what do you envision right away? You envision yourself where? As you're in this race. You vision yourself in an arena. Right? So you're running the race and you're in an arena. Now, I looked up the ancient Greek Colosseums, and this is actually a couple of pictures of some of those that are still standing today. All right? Now, I didn't go to Rome. I've been in Rome, and I've seen the Colosseum there, but it was more for gladiators and killing and all of that. But the Greek Colosseum was for the sports, for the Olympics, for running, and doing all these things. And so as you see that, and as you envision yourself there, I mean, you're in this big arena and you're running. Now, some have interpreted this as you're running, these people that are saved, like we read about in Hebrews 11, that they're looking down on you, okay? And they're watching you. And I don't have a real problem with that if someone wants to interpret it that way, because the word witness can mean two things, and one of them is someone who is witnessing something. But the other is someone who you see. Now, I believe he's saying it's not that they can see us so much as it is we can see them. So here we are, we're running this race for God. And as we're running this race for God, we can see all these Old Testament saved people up there in the stands watching us. And let's say you're running along, and you get kind of tired, and you feel, man, I think I might just stop for a little while. And then you look up in the stands, and who's there? Ruth. Bless her heart. I mean, she's up there and you think, oh man, look at her. I mean, she went through so much. She lost her husband in death, and then she lost her father-in-law in death, and it was just her and her mother-in-law, and they were in some bad financial times, and yet she trusted in a God that wasn't even the God of her own people. And God took care of her, and answered her prayers. And if Ruth can make it, then I think maybe I can make it a little further. You know what I mean? And so you start going along, and maybe you get a little more tired. You say, oh man, I'm really getting tired now. And you look up there, and there's old Jonathan, I mean, poor guy. Here was a guy, his father was anointed king, and then God anoints David king while his father's king. And so Jonathan loves David, and he loves his father, and he tries to bring them together, but he can't get them together. And his whole life is this struggle, between who he cares about and what happens. He ends up dying on a battlefield. Well, if Jonathan can make it, I believe I can make it a little bit too, a little further. So you dig down deeper and you start going, and then all of a sudden you hit a rock, and you fall right down. I mean, you commit a sin, and that sin is bad. Okay, and you're laying there in the dirt, having committed that sin, and you think to yourself, I've sinned, and then the devil is right there in your ear, and what's he saying to you? He's saying, you're no good. You can't serve God. How can you dare get up in front of these people and talk to them about God? Look at the things you did. Look at that sin that you've committed. And you start feeling shame, and you think, well, I can never do this again. And then you look up in the stand, and lo and behold, who's up there? David. Here's David in the stands. David, who was a king and could have had anything he wanted. And he's looking out his window in the morning, and he sees Bathsheba taking a bath out there, and he's lust after her, and he wants her, and he sees her, and he decides that I'm king, I should have her. And so he takes her, and he sleeps with her. And then he gets worried she might be pregnant. So what does he do? Calls her husband in, because she was married. Calls him in and says, go be with your wife. And he said, I ain't going to be with my wife. How can I be with my wife when my brothers are out there fighting for God in the kingdom? I'm not going to go and enjoy my wife. And so he didn't go. And so what did David do? He had him murdered. He had him sent to the front lines and killed. Okay? Now, David, I'm sure, justified himself, rationalized it, everything. Well, she shouldn't have been out there bathing, and I'm just a man. I can't help it when I see a woman, and that's beautiful, and she's out there naked like that. And after all, I didn't kill the man, I didn't kill him. Somebody else killed him. And so he's rationalizing that whole situation. But for, what was it, a year or 2 years? The Bible says that sin was eating him alive. He said it was like my bones were all drying up inside of me, And then what happened? Nathan the prophet comes along, and Nathan gets in there and tells him that parable about a man who's got all these sheep, and that one has one little ewe lamb, and he loves it with all his heart. And the man who had all these sheep did what? Stole the man's lamb. And David just gets up and says, tell me who this guy is. I'll have him killed. And what did Nathan say? You are the man. And then David goes and he pours his heart out in Psalms 50, and he says, against thee and thee only have I sinned. In other words, he comes to repentance. And then what does God say at the end of his life? David was a man, what? After God's own heart. And if David can commit adultery, and he can commit murder, and he can still be a man after God's own heart, you know what? I can get forgiveness too. And so I get up, brush myself off, and get back in the race. You know what I mean? And so I think that's what it is. It's just looking up at those men of old and getting that strength from them. Then he says, and then as you're running the race, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that does easily beset us. So easily beset us. Now notice there are two things here, and they're both not sin. Okay. One is sin, and one is not sin. Okay. Let me. I was studying up on the Greek races historically, and what I could come up with is that they used to train with weights. They would take the weights and tie them around their legs, and around their thighs, and around their waist, and their arms, and on their back and their front, and they would run with all these weights on them, and that's how they would train for the race. But when it came time for the race, what did they do? They took those weights all off. They got rid of them, all right? And that's not all they got rid of. They were completely nude, actually. I was looking for a picture to show, and most of them I couldn't show because they were off the ancient pottery that they found. So I finally found this one, which I think is G-rated anyway. So, you know, they had that weight. They had to take the weight off of them. It'd be just like today when you see a line of people getting ready to run a marathon. They're dressed in what? Little shorts, you know, and tank tops and a little sweatband, and they're up there moving with their water, you know, and everything ready to go. And say there's one guy standing alongside of them in the line, and he's got a full suit on, a trench coat, he's got a hat, he's got galoshes on, he's got 2 suitcases, one in each hand. And I don't know the guy, but I can tell you this much about him. He's not going to finish the race. I mean, you got to get rid of it. Get rid of every weight that is holding you back. Now, the thing about these weights is they're not necessarily sin. I mean, you can get involved so much in things of this life that it can hold you back from God. I mean, you could be a hobby. I wish that I could fix cars, you know. Yeah, I mean, it'd be nice, you know what I mean? I asked Dad about fixing one. He said, just steal another one. Don't worry about it. You know? But, you know, it was like these guys, they work on these cars and they fix them up and then they sell them. So they got a hobby that makes money. But if you're so involved in that hobby that you don't have time for God and for serving God and worshiping God, then you need to get rid of it. It can be something like recreation, golfing, or fishing, or hunting. Those are not evil things or sinful things, but sometimes you can get so consumed with them that you just need to get it off of your job. You can be in debt. It's not wrong to be in debt, but in so much debt that you just got to work yourself crazy to get out of the debt. So he says, get rid of every weight that's going to hold you back in this race for God. And then he says, and what? And the what? The sin. So what's the sin in this context of the book of Hebrews? What's the sin? Anything that hinders you, but specifically in this book. What was the sin? Returning to the old way, or unbelief, right? It's unbelief. Believing that you're not doing right by the service of God that you're giving. You just don't have any trust. He that come to God must believe that he is, and that he's what? A rewarder of those that seek him. Okay? And so you got to get rid of that idea that you can't make it. But any sin in the context will do. It's okay. But still, I think it's important to see that this is the sin of the book of Hebrews. Get rid of that unbelief, all right, and run with patience. When the Greeks were running, the athletes were running, and they were coming around toward the end of the race, and their chest was about to bust, and they were exhausted, and everything. One of the officials would stand up at the end of the race, and he would hold that crown and wave it back and forth, and they would see it gleaming in the sun, and they would just dig in harder and stronger, because that's where it was. That was all the glory that they wanted, to win the race. And so they would dig in deeper. Well, for us, our crown is Jesus. It says there, looking unto Jesus as we're running the race, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And so here, Jesus is the one that we look to. And, we think about Jesus as the one who authored our faith. That is, he gave it to us. But we don't think of him as the one who's helping us to continue it, doing the finisher of our faith. We think it's all up to us sometimes. But Jesus is the author and the finisher of our faith. And he is our victory. And it says, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. Now, what was the joy that set before him? What was that?
Us.
Okay. That's good. You must have been in my class before. Some people will say, well, you go back and be with the Father. No, he was with the Father already in glory. That wasn't the joy. They said, well, the cross itself. No. How did he feel about the cross? It says it right there. He what? He despised the cross. He hated it, all right? In fact, it was shameful to him. But it was the people. It was that someday he's going to be able to walk up and put his arm around Don over here and say, Don, it's so good to see you here. And introduce you to everyone and say, I died to get you here. And Edwina, he's going to say, here she is, and this is Edwina. And I'm so glad that she's here. I died to get her here. And so it's the fact that you are, his joy. That's why he did what he did. If it wasn't for you, he wouldn't have done it. I mean, to be hanged naked, the shame of being innocent and being hanged naked in front of your mother and your disciples, he hated that. He hated it. But you are the thing. I think about the cross. Now I can't ever get Mel Gibson's movie out of my head. Can you? I mean, did you? How many of you saw that movie? That oh man, Mel Gibson's movie, the Passion. Oh man, he really brought out the truth about how horrible it was for Jesus to go to the cross and what he went through there, and it's really, really tough. And then he says, for consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest you be weary and faint in your mind. So in other words, keep your eye on Jesus. Think about what he went through to get you where you are in your relationship with God of going to heaven. And therefore you won't get weary and lose faith. For he says, you have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. Now, I think that really scares me. I mean, these Christians were persecuted, as we read in chapter 10, but they weren't being killed yet for their faith. All right? So, we haven't strived. Next, true faith understands that God's discipline is not contrary to God's love. And that is in verses 5 through 14. Let's take a look at that. It says, and have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciples or disciplines the ones he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Now let's stop here and think about what he's saying. He's saying to these guys, he's saying, okay, you have gone through some suffering. And what happens when you go through suffering? What's the first thing that comes to your mind when something bad happens? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Why me?
Why me? Okay. Mine is, what am I doing wrong, God? You ever have that? Something bad happens, you think, oh, I'm just not living right, or something's wrong here, and so you start getting these thoughts here, and what he says to them is, look, I'm going to tell you something. You as a Christian are going to get disciplined by the Lord. Have you forgotten what Proverbs says? That if a father loves you, he's going to do what? He's going to discipline you. Now, I'm sorry to say that's not the truth today in many cases. And I've got to say I'm sorry because I can't relate, to this. I had two whippings in my whole life. Just two. Okay. I see some of you smiling. And I deserve both of them. My father only whipped me twice. And I deserved it both times. Once, they were going to send me to reform school. And he came over with his girlfriend, and he said, well, maybe they can teach you something in reform school. And I let out a series of cursing at him and called him every name in the book, and he got up and gave me a black eye, But that was one time I deserved it. But the next time was kind of humorous when you think about it, is I went down south with him, with his family, He'd drive me down to see his family, and we went in there, and it was in Arkansas, and they'd go out and chop cotton. And all these young girls would go out there with the chopping cotton. Boy, I just loved that whole situation. And I went out there with them, and at lunch they would have this big meal. And it was and the women would work on it all morning, and then the leftovers would be supper. So everybody sat down for this big meal and everything, and I sat down and I filled up my plate, and I got up and started in the living room. And the whole family was just sitting there. They were just like, they never seen any kid do anything like that. Because nobody, I was on my own mostly, and so my dad said, sit down. And I said, I ain't sitting down. So he took his belt off and whoop, and hit me in the back with that belt, and I sat down, But that was the only two I ever got. Now with my kids, I didn't know, so it says spare the rod and spoil the child. So I did spank my kids, and one of them, all I had to do was mention spanking, and he got all upset. He was heeing and hawing like a billy goat or something, but my other kid, he was more like me. I could bend him over and spank his rear end, and he wouldn't utter a word. Not a word, And I spanked him, except for one time. My son, I was preaching in Fritch, and I was sitting in the office there, and I got a phone call from the superintendent of the school. And I answered the phone. He said, Mr. Kimber, I'd like to talk to you about your son. I said, I was thinking, wondering what he's done. Good, Probably did something great, and everything, and he's going to get an award or something. And he said, yeah, Mr. Kimbrough, he was running across the roof of the school building. And I said, he was running across the roof. And he said, yes, Mr. Kimbrough, but that's not the bad part of it. And I said, really? What's the bad part? Well, when we caught him and we brought him down on a ladder, and we asked him his name, he said his name was Johnny Johnson. So he gave him a phony name, in other words. And of course they knew, that he was my son. And so I said, oh boy, I'll take care of him. So I got me one of those big switches. We had one of those trees that had those weeping willow trees. And I had one of those weeping willow switches, and I took it off, the tree, and I was waiting there like this, and he come in the house, and, I'm so sorry. And I said, son, I'm going to give you a whipping. It's going to be a bad one. And there ain't no power on earth that can stop me. And you're about to get it. And he just looked at me, and he was just so scared. And I said, but I thought that maybe this is the only time in your life I can really teach you a lesson. So what I'm going to do, son, is I'm going to let Jesus take your whipping. I'm going to let him take your whipping. And I'm not going to give it to you today. And I said, no, don't ever try it again. This is the only time this is ever going to happen. But I want you to think about Jesus taking your whipping for you. And that was a big moment in his life, when he deserved a whipping, and I let him go. I didn't whip him. But, just like that one teacher said, with boys, you should whip them once a month at least, because they're going to do things that you're not going to catch them for. And if they don't, then you need to whip them because they're sissy enough not to do something bad. But anyway, I don't know if that's the right philosophy, but anyway. So anyway, God disciplines us, and his discipline is not because he wants us to hurt. It's because he's treating us as his children. And verse 7, he says, if you're not disciplined and undergo discipline, then you are not a legitimate child. Now, when you read history about how they use this word, they use the word bastards. And that was someone who simply did not get any inheritance at all from the father. Okay? They weren't looked at as a son. So let's say a son went out, say a father went out and had an indiscretion and had a child. That child was not to inherit anything. Okay? And so, in other words, because you are going to inherit stuff, what? God disciplines you. And don't think it's strange, I think Peter said it all when he said, don't think it's strange when fiery trials come upon you. I mean, look what happened to Jesus, right? If it happened to Jesus, why is it strange that it's going to happen to you? I think we need to understand that. And then he goes on, moreover, we all have human fathers who discipline us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. So that's the end result of discipline, is that we'll be holy or set apart for God. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Discipline's hard to learn. And I thank God that I went into the military service, to stay out of jail. I went into the military service, and I went through boot camp, and I got disciplined. And they taught me discipline because I didn't learn it, as a child, but they taught it to me, and that was a good thing. Therefore, he says, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees, make level path for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather be healed. In other words, help your brothers and sisters to understand when they're going through something bad, it's not because God doesn't love them. He does love you. It's just, it could be a number of different things. And he may be disciplining you. And then true faith understands the imperative to live holy. He says in verse 14 here, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see God. In other words, he's saying to us that if God went through so much to make peace with us and bring us together to him, then we should be peacemakers ourselves and try to be peace, And sometimes, when you stand up for the truth, you kind of glory in it. You know what I mean? And it's okay to stand up for the truth, but it's quite another thing to stand up for the truth and to be divisive and hurtful, and to break up peace. We're supposed to be at peace with everyone. And even when it happens that we have to stand up for the truth, it should sadden us, and we should do it with compassion. Let me tell you, we got on some of these Church of Christ Facebook places, and some of the things they say in their site, because my daughter put some of my sermon or lessons from here on there, and they'll probably hear this. But some of the things they say might be true, but the way they say it is so divisive and so uncaring and without any compassion in those words, And I know we got to teach the truth, but Paul said teach the truth in what? Teach the truth in love. We're supposed to be peacemakers. Blessed, the Beatitude, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. So if you're not a peacemaker, what does that make you? Not a son of God, right? And that's a pretty serious thing. But there's limitations. We're to try to be peaceful with everyone. It says, and to be holy. For without holiness, no one will see the Lord. In other words, you want to be be peaceful with it. But if you get in a situation where you have to give up your holiness to be at peace with people, then you don't give up your holiness. Okay? You don't do things that are against God in order to be peaceful with people. And we are in a situation, in many cases, in that way today, aren't we? In this world that we live in. People say we want to be peaceful. We want to all, agree and everything. Well, we can be peaceful to a point, and that is unless we give up our holiness, okay? And then he says, see to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up and causes trouble and defile many. Now let's talk about this for a second. Fall short of the grace of God, all right? In context, how would you fall short of the grace of God in this letter? be an unbeliever and go back to Judaism. Now, what was Judaism? A law of what? Works, right? Different from the law of grace, the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus. Okay, different. So the law of works, which is what? Legalism. Now, we have to be careful that we don't fall away from the grace of God, okay, and start teaching legalism. Now, we're not bad about that today. There was a time, I think, when in the history of the church, that even my time in it, is where you could see preachers get up and draw a line and say, on this side your good works and that side your bad works, and if you don't outweigh your bad works, then you're going to hell. You know, I mean, seriously, that's how some sermons were preached, and it's simply not the truth. That's false doctrine. Okay, but we're not hard. I mean, somebody could be guilty of sexual immorality. We'd be all hard on them, but they can get up and preach against grace and preach false doctrine, but don't say a word. All right. But now it's not that way. What's happened nowadays seems to be more and more. And I'm not talking about the preacher here or Singing Oaks, okay? I'm just saying in general. What do we see? How far has grace gone? Hyper grace, or grace being used as an excuse to do anything. To not care, to not be involved, any of that stuff. And so we got to be careful in both ways. And don't let any bitter root grow up in you and cause you trouble. So bitter root is, you know, one of the bad things about having multiple congregations, you know what it is all around, is that you get in a situation in a church where you have disagreements and things like that, or something happens bad. Instead of working out the problem, what do? Go to another church. Well, that doesn't help you. You still got a bitter root inside of you. And it's better sometimes to go ahead and get that straight. You know, if you want to leave, that's one thing. And I'm not against more than one congregation. You want to love everybody in different congregations, but the fact of it is we've got to work hard to keep bitterness out of our lives. And see to it that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance right as the oldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he couldn't change what he'd done. Now, it's interesting here. He says, don't involve yourself in sexual immorality or godless behavior, like Esau. Now, I think in the King James Version, it says, what does it say in the King? Profane like Esau. Now, what do you think of when you think of godless or profane? What do you think of when you read that in the Bible? Someone says something profane, right? Or, well, actually, all it is not thinking about the spiritual. Like to Esau, all he could see was the physical, right? I mean, I'm hungry. What do I care about a birthright? What do I care about, you know, the seed promise and all that stuff? I need something to eat right now. And so he sold it all for a bowl of soup. Can you imagine how God must have felt when he's gone through so much and was going through so much to get his son to this world? And Esau was in line to get that blessing, and Esau sold it all for a bowl of soup. I mean, that'd be pretty rough, wouldn't it? And did he repent? Did Esau repent? Look at the verse here. Yeah, he repented with tears. But sometimes you can be godless and you can go so far that you can't find your way back again. You know, like Niagara Falls, there's a sign on Niagara Falls that says point of no return. If you're going toward the falls and you hit that point of no return, then you're going over, you know. And Esau wanted it back, but he couldn't get it back. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If it's been a blessing to you, you can go to johndkimbrough.com to hear more episodes. You may also subscribe to my free podcast on Apple Podcast or anywhere you listen to podcasts. You may email me at john@johndkimbrough.com for questions or comments. Thank you.